She gave him everything: love, loyalty, and even a revolution that changed England's faith. But when she could not give him a male heir, King Henry VIII delivered something far darker: death. In today's video, we'll trace the rise, power, and tragic downfall of Anne Boleyn, the queen whose life Henry tried to erase, yet whose legacy shaped history forever. The rise of Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn was born into ambition. The daughter of Thomas Boleyn and Elizabeth Howard, she was raised with one goal, whispered in every corridor of her family home: power, influence, and a place at court. But Anne wasn't just another girl trying to climb the ladder of Tudor politics. She was clever, witty, and trained in the courts of France and the Netherlands, the very best education a young woman of her station could receive. Her opportunity came at the royal court of Queen Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife. Anne arrived as a maid of honor, carrying herself with a mix of elegance and sharp intelligence. It wouldn't be long before the king took notice. A spark lit between them, one that would ignite a chain of events so explosive it would shake the very foundations of England. But Anne was no ordinary temptress. Unlike other women who surrendered to the king's desires, she refused to be his mistress, insisting that if she were to be with him, it would be as his wife. This bold and dangerous stance gave her unusual power over Henry, showing that she understood survival in the court required not only love, but strategy, ambition, and careful calculation. And Henry was captivated. What began as curiosity quickly grew into obsession, and Anne's refusal made her irresistible. This was no simple love story. It was a dangerous game played in a court full of spies, schemers, and knives hidden beneath the velvet sheets. Henry's obsession with Anne sparked what would later be called the Great Matter, his desperate, all-consuming need for a male heir. The Great Divorce. Henry VIII's marriage to Catherine of Aragon was supposed to secure the Tudor dynasty, but instead it felt cursed. Years passed and Catherine bore only one surviving child, a daughter named Mary. Henry needed a son, a strong and legitimate heir to carry on his name and secure the throne, and in his eyes, Anne Boleyn was the solution. But getting rid of Catherine was no simple matter. The Pope refused Henry's plea for annulment, the laws of God in Rome stood firm, and Henry's desperation grew. Anne had become the forbidden prize, a woman whose very presence could topple kings and kingdoms. Cardinal Wolsey, Henry's once powerful chief advisor, had tried to navigate the storm. He worked to secure the annulment, to bend the Pope to the king's will, but failed. Wolsey fell from grace, stripped of power, leaving Henry with a hunger that only one thing could satisfy: a new path, alliance, and law of the land. This was where Thomas Cromwell, clever and ruthless, and Thomas Cranmer, ambitious and bold, came in. Together they would help Henry tear apart centuries of tradition. The king broke from Rome and declared himself the head of the Church of England. England itself trembled under the shock. To marry Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII would tear apart Christendom itself. In secrecy and shadows, Henry and Anne wed in 1533, and just months later, Anne was crowned queen in a ceremony of dazzling splendor and a public display of power, ambition, and danger. The court watched, some in awe, some in fear. Every jewel and pageant, every oath taken that day was a signal. The old order was gone, and a new age had begun. And then came the ultimate test. Anne was pregnant. Henry's dreams and obsession, his desperation, his lust for a son, now rested on the fragile life growing in her womb. The king's obsession and Anne's ambition had reshaped England, but the path ahead would be paved with peril. This was more than love, it was power, and the consequences would be deadly. The Daughter and the Curse. September 7, 1533, Anne Boleyn gives birth. The nation expected a prince, but instead, it would be a girl who cried in the Tower of London, and her name was Elizabeth. Henry VIII's disappointment was a shadow over celebration. He hid it behind forced smiles, elaborate ceremonies, and public rejoicing. But the king's desire for a male heir was not so easily fooled. Anne comforted herself, whispering in private, "A son will come next." But the court and the kingdom were less forgiving. Public opinion turned sour. The same woman who had inspired a revolution, who had caused kings and cardinals to bend, was now whispered about as the king's whore. She was blamed for the break with Rome, for Catherine's downfall, for the turmoil that rocked England, and rumors swirled, those of pride, cruelty, and ambition gone unchecked. And yet beneath the gossip was a deeper truth. It was fear. Fear for her life, fear of losing the king, fear for the child that she held. Isolation pressed in from every side. Time passed on and Henry and Anne drifted apart. The king's attention wavered. Anne suffered miscarriage after miscarriage. 3 times, hope had died quietly in her arms. Courtiers murmured of witchcraft and bad omens, as if she alone was carrying the weight of the kingdom's sins. And then Jane Seymour appeared. Young, demure, and poised, the very image of what Henry desired in a wife. She moved through the court with quiet charm, catching the king's eye. Anne watched, being trapped between power and danger. The same sharp mind and strong spirit that had once won the king had now made her a target. The court had turned against her, and fate began its slow and merciless march. Every victory that Anne had fought for, every hope of giving England a Tudor prince, now hung by a thread. The stage would be set, and history was about to watch the fall of a queen. The conspiracy. Early in 1536, Catherine of Aragon died, and Henry VIII celebrated, wearing yellow to mark the ending of one chapter and the hope of a brand new beginning. But the promise of joy would be short-lived. Weeks later, Anne suffered a miscarriage. A male heir was lost, and that left the king's dream unfulfilled and her position uncertain. Henry's attention turned to Jane Seymour, a young lady-in-waiting whose quiet manner and poised elegance had fit the king's desire for a son and a compliant queen. At the same time, Thomas Cromwell, skilled and calculating, saw an opportunity to remove a queen who had become a threat to his ambitions. Anne and Cromwell, who were once allies, had clashed over money, influence, and the future of the Church of England. Cromwell began acting behind the scenes, using the king's growing suspicion as a weapon. Rumors of adultery, familial relations, and treason had spread carefully, each whisper designed to make Anne appear to be guilty. And arrests would follow. Mark Smeaton, a musician in Anne's service, was accused and forced into confession. Henry Norris, Francis Weston, and Anne's own brother George Boleyn were caught up in a web of charges that barely made any sense. Innocence offered no protection. The machinery of power moved relentlessly. Anne would be taken to the Tower of London, thrown into isolation and confusion. It was there that she feared for herself and her family. The people that she loved were under arrest. Their fates were tied to her own. And yet, she maintained her dignity and composure, knowing that her fate would be decided not by truth, but by the king and the currents of court politics. The conspiracy was complete. Every element and miscarriage, the jealous rivals, the whispering courtiers, Cromwell's manipulations, it had all aligned. The queen who had captivated a king and reshaped a nation would now be trapped by the very power that she had once wielded. Her fall was inevitable. The trial and the sword. The charges against Anne Boleyn were shocking, even by the most brutal of standards of Tudor England. Adultery, familial relations, and plotting the death of the king. The court was carefully orchestrated, a theater of power where justice was only an illusion. Her jury would be packed with men chosen to guarantee her downfall, which included even her own uncle Thomas Howard and Henry Percy, a former lover. Even those who had once loved or trusted her were enlisted as instruments of her destruction. The evidence became flimsy, sometimes even impossible. Dates that didn't match, confessions extracted under duress, and witnesses whose loyalties were suspect. Every detail would be twisted to build a case that could justify the king's desire for a new wife. Yet despite the absurdity, the verdict became unanimous. Anne Boleyn would be found guilty. Through it all, she remained composed, eerily calm in the face of condemnation. Her dignity in the courtroom was striking. The same sharp intelligence and poise that had once captivated Henry, now standing as her shield. Even as her fate would be sealed, she carried herself with a quiet courage of someone who knew her own innocence. Henry, in a rare action of perceived mercy, spared her the common axe, but instead he arranged for a skilled swordsman to perform the execution, a method considered swift and more honorable for a queen. The date would be May 19th of 1536. The Tower courtyard, normally alive with the bustle of royal guards and courtiers, was cloaked in a cold, mourning silence. Anne was led to the scaffold, dressed in a dark gown, her mantle removed, hair tucked neatly under a coif. The procession would be solemn. Courtiers and officials watched, some in sorrow, others in relief, and her composure never faltered. Even in the shadow of death, there was a faint trace of humor, a small defiance in the acknowledgement of her fate. The executioner's sword flashed, and in one single precise stroke, the woman who had reshaped England and challenged a king and altered the course of the church was gone. The courtyard fell to silence, heavy and profound. The woman for whom a kingdom had split its faith, who had navigated ambition, love, and betrayal, was erased in the coldest of ironies, one single strike ending a life that had changed history forever. The aftermath and erasure. Only 11 days after Anne Boleyn's death, Henry VIII married Jane Seymour, moving swiftly to secure the son that he so desperately desired. In the wake of her execution, Anne's presence was methodically erased from the kingdom. Portraits were destroyed, symbols of her reign dismantled, and her name quietly expunged from official records. Her remains were laid to rest in an unmarked grave at St. Peter ad Vincula, the Tower Chapel offering no marker or memorial and no acknowledgement of the woman who had once been queen. For a time, she had vanished from memory, reduced to whispers and rumors, a shadow of scandal and intrigue. Yet history refused to obey Henry's command. The story of Anne Boleyn persisted, carried in letters, poems, and the memories of those who had witnessed her life and her death. Though her life ended in violence, her bloodline endured. 22 years later, her daughter Elizabeth ascended the throne, transforming England in ways that Henry could never have imagined. Through Elizabeth, Anne's legacy would be restored, her name regained dignity, her lineage reshaped the destiny of a nation, and the queen who had been condemned became the mother of an age. The Elizabethan age, celebrated for culture, exploration, and power, bore the imprint of a woman whose life that Henry VIII had tried to erase. Though the king wielded the sword, history wielded the memory. The woman meant to vanish from records returned, not as a queen, but as a force that would define an era, a ghostly echo of ambition, resilience, and the enduring power of legacy. Anne Boleyn's life would be brief, her death violent, yet her story refused to vanish. The king had tried to erase her, but history would not forget. Through her daughter Elizabeth, her legacy endured, shaping an age while proving that even in the shadows of betrayal and blood, some names can never be silenced.